Hello everyone, Ember here, and welcome back to a new video. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at some upcoming future box deck lists from Temporal Forces. Now, I nearly said Paradox Rift there because Temporal Forces is basically Paradox Rift 2.0 anyways, but still, Temporal Forces is the upcoming set. So this deck, as you might have guessed by the title, thumbnail, and your general knowledge of future Pokemon, is a general toolbox deck. So it's basically focusing around all these different attackers that you can take, which makes it very versatile in terms of what you can actually play in the deck, which is very cool. Unfortunately, the energy is split across multiple types, including not limited to grass, lightning, psychic, and metal. So plenty of choice on how to build your decks. So most of these lists will be running 2 to 3 different energy, typically. Of course, you can play the Reboot Pod, which will help with energy acceleration, and it's probably the best card that this deck has, apart from a translation that we'll look at in a second, which will help accelerate energy. No spoilers. But yeah, Reboot Pod is definitely the saving grace here. I would say if this deck didn't have that ace spec, then it would struggle quite a bit because just keeping energy in play and charging up energy might be quite difficult for this deck. Thankfully, we do have EXP share, which I hadn't realized is actually sticking around post rotation, which is fantastic. So, if you don't have any XP shares and you plan to play Future Box, I would definitely recommend picking a few of those up right now. But yeah, one of the new translations is actually this Miraidon EX. We can quickly go over this. 220 HP Dragon type future Pokemon with no weakness or resistance because it is a Dragon type, which is fantastic. It does help in some situations. Has 2 attacks. Both of them are pretty good. Repulsor Bolt does 60 damage for Lightning Psychic, and if your opponent's active Pokemon has any damage counters on it, this attack does 100 more damage. So basically, you have to look at this attack as if you'd already damaged them beforehand. So you're not necessarily just doing 160, you're doing 160 plus whatever you've already done. And there is a card that we're going to take a look at that does about 60 damage, can be modified up to 80 and stuff. So that card, which is the single prize Miraidon, I'll not spoil it, I guess. But yeah, that single prize Miraidon will ping for like 60, 80 damage. So then you can come in with this Miraidon and finish something off. So that's just an idea potentially. So yeah, Repulsor Bolt, quite useful. And then Cyber Drive is for those bigger KOs. It is for a Psychic, a Lightning, and a Colorless. So quite expensive for this deck to be paying 3 different energy, but effectively, or just 2 Psychic and Lightning or something. But 220 either way is a ton of damage, and of course it will be used to KO mostly just other basic EX Pokemon. But yeah, pretty good card overall. Some other translations to look at include this single prize Miraidon, which is 110 HP basic Dragon type, that for a single colorless energy does 40 damage and then allows you to accelerate up to 2 basic energy cards and attach them to your future Pokemon in any way you like. Then you get to shuffle your deck. So it's just good because that 40 damage can be modified with Future Booster Capsule and, of course, Iron Crowns, which was the very first card in the video, which I kind of just skimmed over. But it does modify your future Pokemon by plus 20 damage, which is fantastic. So one of them, and then plus a capsule, or just 2 Iron Crown instead. You're already doing 80 damage, which is enough to KO stuff like Ralts and Charmanders post-rotation, which is cool. But it's also just good for setting up KOs, like we literally just talked about how Repulsor Bolt is not quite doing enough damage to KO like EX Pokemon, so this is just like a good option to set that up. So yeah, it's pretty good. Sparking Strike is okay. 160 is a meaty ton of damage. Could be used to KO stuff like Mimikyu, I guess, or like, what's it called? Snorlax, that's the one. Snorlax. You could KO stuff like Snorlax with Sparking Strike, but it is quite an expensive attack to use. The other card that is pretty key with these lists is Reboot Pod, which says attach a basic energy card from your discard pile to each of your future Pokemon in play, which is a much better translation than the one we got initially, which was just uber complicated and led to many people guessing just what on earth does this card actually do. But thankfully, it's a very clear translation with this one, so just attach a basic energy from your discard pile to each of your future Pokemon in play. Very easy to understand. So yeah, if you have 4 Pokemon in play, you're accelerating 4 energy, but of course it's just 1 energy to each one, which is a little bit frustrating. You would hope that this card could have accelerated all the energy to just 1 or 2 Pokemon, but sadly not. Still, it will put energy on stuff like Iron Crowns, which does actually help in some regards because it means you could then use them as a pivot, even if you don't want to attack with them. So I do think it's quite handy in that regard. And of course, there's stuff like Energy Switch, so you could utilize energy in that regard as well. But as for the deck lists, which is the reason why everyone clicked on this video, of course, this first build is basically just like a more straightforward build, a nice straightforward build. You know how I like my straightforward builds. And this one is roughly as straightforward as you can get, unless you count, playing 4 different basic energy, but still. It is a very cool build. We're playing 2 copies of the baby Miraidon, then 3 copies of Iron Crown, not playing 4 copies because it's just a bit excessive at that point. Then playing 2 copies of Iron Leaves, which I'm personally surprised about because Iron Leaves moves all the grass energy to itself, but then it's not really doing a whole lot of damage, and once it gets KO'd, you've lost all the grass energy. But to be honest, I think as long as you can KO Charizard at least once with this guy, then it's probably worth it. Question mark? Not sure, not tested out yet, but it is interesting to see, and I'm curious to see if Iron Leaves is actually as good as, Japan seems to think it is. But then, of course, there's 1 Iron Hands, which is an option that you can use, so Reboot Pod will be able to accelerate synergy to that guy. There's also 1 copy of Delibird, which is quite nice. If you don't know what this guy does, you can basically just put him on the bottom of your deck, I believe. Yeah, put him on the bottom of your deck, and then force your opponent to switch out their active Pokemon. So that's just quite nice. Just forces out something annoying into the active spot, especially if your opponent only has 1 Pokemon on their bench. Then you could potentially use it as a gust effect. So that's kind of cool. Also playing 1 Iron Treads, which is a bit more of a weird choice. The Iron Treads, I think, is in all of these lists, bar 1, which is super interesting because unfortunately the card isn't super great. It has an ability that lets it dual type as both fighting and metal, which is kind of cool. But then the attack does 60 damage for 1 metal and a colorless, and then you move 1 energy from that Pokemon to one of your benched. So it's kind of a more beefed up version of the baby Miraidon. But at the same time, you need 2 energy to use. Sorry. So you need 2 energy to use. So it's a little bit more awkward, I'm not like a huge fan of this card. It's okay, right? It's okay because you're starting off higher than 40, doing 60 base. That's cool. But at the same time, you need 2 energy. So this is only really good if you go first, I think. And this deck doesn't really have many ways of finding Pokemon aside from, well, I guess you have 4 copies of Techno Radar, so it's not like super bad. But yeah, I'm not like overly sold on this card. It's not like super great. I don't know. Maybe it's easier to like get into active spot because you have future capsules that give stuff free retreat, and then you also have Town Store as well as Arvin. So maybe it is easier, but I don't know. I'm just not that sold on single prize Iron Treads. I've spent way too long on this card already, but yeah, I don't know. It just seems a bit weird. Then we have Mew EX just to act as a bit of draw power because this deck has no draw engine whatsoever apart from Radiant Greninja. Then also 1 Minior, which is here basically to deal with Snorlax, which is going to be one of the best decks post-rotation, probably. So yeah, that's quite scary. As for the trainers, nothing too crazy here. There is 2 copies of Lost Vacuum, which is quite scary. I think this is probably here for the mirror match as well, because EXP share is kind of a big deal for this deck, and I think it will be for several other decks as well, like Torterra and stuff. So having Lost Vacuum could also deal with the tools that are coming out. Maximum Belt is one of them, the one that says plus 50 damage to opponent's EX. That might not be super relevant against this deck, but just being able to get rid of it would be quite nice and could help out in certain situations. So yeah, Lost Vacuum is a very scary card indeed. But going on to the second list here, it's not too different, but this list is choosing to play a higher count of the Miraidons and actually focusing more on the single prize Miraidon as well as the Dragon type Miraidon that we talked about earlier, the Miraidon EX, which is kind of cool. Also playing Iron Leaves again, and playing a single copy of the Iron Hands single prize Pokemon. So effectively what this guy does, he's kind of niche, but he does 80 damage for 2 lightning and a colors, which is a bit, pathetic and bad. But it does do 160 if your opponent is an EX, which is just pretty good. It's just nice. I think it might also do 160 if they're a V, which is quite key, because then at that point, you could also knock out a Palkia. And Palkia looks pretty good with Goldengo and Raging Bolt post-rotation. So Iron Hands, definitely a solid option to include. Also playing an Iron Valiant single prize. I personally don't think this card is super great, but for single colors, it does 20 damage and then 20 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. It could be quite nice, especially if you get a bunch of Iron Crown EX on the bench. Yeah, that's the right Pokemon. I'm getting these all confused because they all have Iron in the name. But yeah, Iron Crowned, bunch of them on the bench, plus a capsule. You can do solid damage and, poke something for 20 on the bench. Is it great? Not really, to be honest. I don't think it's worth it in most times, but especially with Manaphy actually just kicking around, that's going to be another thing. Like Manaphy's going in Charizard, it's going in, Goldango and stuff. So yeah, it's a bit scary. This deck doesn't have enough bench space, by the way, to play Manaphy. So if you're interested in playing spread post rotation, then I've got some great news for you because yeah, spread decks are going to be great against this stuff. But yeah, I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of this Zenblade Iron Valiant. Also noteworthy is there's not really any Iron Valiant EX in these decks. Something else worth mentioning. But yeah, Iron Treads EX again, not the EX, sorry. Iron Treads, just regular. So he's in the deck. Radiant Greninja's in the deck because it's just such a good draw power. We can warrant at least one of them. Also playing Pidgeot V, which kind of prevents you decking out against Snorlax, which is quite nice. But it is also there because we can take advantage of Forest Sealed Stone. And Forest Sealed Stone just gives us access to at least one more card throughout the game. So maybe like a niche basic energy that you can't find, or like a boss's orders could be quite useful, or like a Super Rod if you want to reuse a certain attacker, because we're playing a lot of one-offs in this deck. So yeah, pretty cool list. I honestly prefer this one to the one we just looked at, I'd say so. Yeah, I think this list is cooler, a bit more straightforward. Next up, though, is we're going full focus on the Iron Leaves. So 3 copies and then 3 Miraidon. So we're just going all in on the grass energy. I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of this because I don't think you have enough hitting power against some of the bigger stage 1 EXs. Against Charizard, you're going to have a field day, of course, against stuff like Chempao, actually, because you can actually hit relevant damage with Iron Leaves eventually because you have 180 and then you just stack a bunch of Iron Crowns on the bench with your capsules and then, you're doing decent damage at that point. However, I don't think this deck is going to be super great against a bunch of other stuff. Definitely more of a niche build of the archetype, I'd say. Also worth mentioning, and I didn't mention this for last list, but both of these are playing Prime Catcher over the Reboot Pod, which is super interesting to see. I would have thought the Reboot Pod is like a must-have in these decks, but clearly not in the eyes of this person. But Iron Valiant DX, that's cool to see at least. So it is in some lists at least. And we'll also set up some more damage with those 2 damage counters. And this player has decided that Future Box needed some draw power, so gave it a 1/1 line of Bibarel. Is it worth it, or would you rather just have 2 cards somewhere else? I personally would say I'd rather just have 2 cards somewhere else. It is a wee bit niche, however, because the issue I have with Bibarel being in this deck is if your opponent KOs a Miraidon initially, which is what you want them to do realistically, right? You want them to have to go through a Miraidon. They KO Miraidon, then they have to KO an EX Pokemon, and then they have to KO another EX Pokemon in theory. So at that point, if Bibarel's in play, they just have to boss Bibarel to take that second prize card. It's taking prize cards in 2s these days. So KO Miraidon, KO Bibarel, that's the equivalent of taking out an EX, which could be quite bulky. So I'm personally not a super big fan of Bibarel. It's also a liability if it gets KO'd and stuff, but yeah, I'm not super sold on that. Luminion V is also a bit strange, but then again, this deck isn't playing Reboot Pod, so it doesn't have to worry about all playing future Pokemon, but still interesting, I guess. And also 1 copy of Thornton, actually. That's pretty interesting. So not sure why we need Thornton in the list. If anyone can tell me why. Why Thornton? Is it because you can bench Bidoof or turn the minion into something else? But yeah, I don't know. It seems interesting. Next up, though, is going to be the last list, I believe, today. And that is going to be basically Future Box from earlier in the video. But this one is playing even more Pokemon, and it's actually playing a 1/1 line of Darkrai V-Star, which is a very, very good idea. And a lot of people have already talked about doing this. So, if you wanted a list for that idea, then here it is. Darkrai V-Star, for those of you who haven't twigged on just yet, is basically here so we can pick up 2 items. So Reboot Pod, basically. And something else. So like an energy switch, for example, that could be really, really good and really strong in certain situations. So yeah, Darkrai V-Star, definitely a really cool inclusion. There's also a bunch of other stuff in here which I'm not super sold on. I would personally cut the Iron Treads for another Miraidon, single prize Miraidon, because I think it's just such a good card in this deck. You might as well play 2 copies of it. But yeah, 2 copies of Iron Hands as well is a little bit sketch, but then again, you are playing 4 copies of Lightning and 4 copies of Grass Energy, actually. So yeah, I think Iron Hands is just like trying to fit all the eggs in one basket with this list in particular. So just like, yeah, I'd remove that card basically. Just, it also just means you're not playing Metal Energy. You could play like a different basic energy if you really wanted to, like a third Psychic. That'd be a good idea. So it also would actually let you tack with Iron Valiant a lot more as well. So yeah, that could be cool. But yeah, either way, Spinning on Power, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think about future decks down below. And yeah, thank you for watching.